Hey, this is Brian again, and I'd like to ask you to do a favor. We can't do this work without people like you, so if you can, please like, share, subscribe, and tell your friends about Bring Back the Porch.
So it's really interesting when you look at this and you put it into perspective that this is basically a good rendition, but it doesn't show really illustrate the water and the mud and stuff like that. Yeah. You see the shell holes, like the craters are here, advancing across no man's land. You see the barbed wire, how it's funneling towards an entrenched machine gun position. And you see everything that's going on. This is what happened. This is what they did.
This episode of Bring Back the Porch brought to you by Bernie Leahy, River Street Realty. Let's get you home. Les, you have a model here of what a typical battlefield would have looked like in World War I. We can see the trenches and the tunnels. Explain how all this came together, how it worked militarily.
Well, this is kind of a highlight of the museum, the World War I section, and it is a trench system that highlights the German trenches on one side, the Canadian trenches on the other side. And you can tell if you look closely, they're very accurate, like the metal corrugated walls and the timbers on the German side. You have the tanks that are advancing across, both the British or Canadian Mark V and the German A7. And then you got the artillery located there, the cavalry, and in some cases the cavalry also worked as not only as reconnaissance, but also moving up supplies. And that really helped a lot. We have all the barbed wire entanglements in there. We've got the survival tree, which is interesting. That came from the Battle of Beaumont-Hamel. And the survival tree was basically said, if you advanced across the battlefield, you got to this point, you might survive. Because the Battle of Beaumont-Hamel was a Newfoundland regiment, and they tried to take the German trench system, and they were basically down to like 4 or 5 or a dozen guys out of 1,100 men. It was unbelievable. We were at that battlefield as well, too. So everything here is very accurate, including the tunnel system that you see underneath here. Now, the tunnel system is really kind of an interesting thing because both the Canadians and the Germans, they employed miners. And these are guys that worked in coal mines, diamond mines, sulfur mines, etc. And what they would do, they would dig from a point on, say the German or Canadians, they dig straight down underneath no man's land until they got to a point that they estimated was beneath the opposing trench system. And they would pack that full of explosives, get out of there and hit the fuse, blow that up, and anything that's underneath that position would just be completely vaporized. And there were circumstances, I mentioned this in our tours, that the officer, having his cigarette outside the trench, and all the explosives were being hauled in, and he just, whatever, he lost count. And they packed this full of explosives, and finally one of the sergeants said, hey, we've got a lot of stuff in there that goes boom. And he said, oh, okay, get out and we'll light it up. Well, when they lit that up, the explosion was so severe that 140 miles across the English Channel, windows in London were shaking from the explosion. And it created a massive crater. We toured one in 2016 called the Lochanar Crater. And it's one of those kind of situations where they just kept packing more and more in there. And when it went boom, it created a crater that was about 300 feet across, about 200 feet deep. You stand at the side of that, you look down and say, oh my God. And it took out a section of German trench that they estimate about 1,500 men, almost instantly vanished. So that was kind of an interesting thing about the tunneling system. And as I said, both the Germans and Canadians are doing that. And every once in a while, one of the guys, the officers would stop, he'd have a stethoscope, he'd hold it up on the side of the wall, and if they heard a scritch, 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 one of their bad guys are on the other side. Pack it full of explosives and get out of there. So it's really interesting when you look at this and you put it into perspective that this is basically a good rendition, but it doesn't show really illustrate the water and the mud and stuff like that. Yeah. You see the shell holes, like the craters are here, advancing across no man's land. You see the barbed wire, how it's funneling towards an entrenched machine gun position. And you see everything that's going on. This is what happened. This is what they did. I'll mention about the German A7V. It's massive. It's a big box with tracks. They had something like 18 men in that thing, which we think about that, oh my God, that is huge. But it was also festooned with 75 millimeter guns and Spandau machine guns. The British tank, the Mark V, that either had the field gun, which was usually about a 2-pounder or a 3-pounder, or it had machine guns. Now you think a tank, like today, yeah, a tank's out there, you fire, your rifle at it, it just bounces off. This wasn't quite the same. Mm-hmm. It wasn't quite the same. Some of the times, even rifle shots would penetrate. Now, here's the other thing. Both of these tanks, they had good engines, not good engines, they were pretty bad.
For the time.
How can I say, primitive, to say it to the least. The men in the tank were sitting here, and the engine was right beside them. There's very little exhaust that would, be vented out. So they were having a lot of issues with that. And guys were, employing if they were operating a machine gun, they'd lean back and they'd lean against an exhaust manifold, they'd get burnt up. So it wasn't exactly the best place to be. However, when they were first, the British tanks, when they were first employed at the Battle of the Somme, the Germans, what is that? There's a more of a cuss phrase that they use, but it was really something really, really innovative and absolutely terrifying to both sides. So it was really quite the thing. Now, all that barbed wire entanglement, we just earlier talked about the barbed wire and stuff like that. You see on the wall here, and this is what I mentioned, is the screw picket. That was an amazing innovation that saved lives because, as I said, send the guys out after dark and with a bundle of sticks. They could do this and use the corkscrew screw picket. Everything was good.
Stealth.
And it's kind of interesting because at my own collection in my private museum in my house, I've got some of those set up in the basement there. And when the curator of the museum at that time, it was I think it was 2010, he said, pointed at that, what's that? And I explained it to him. And he said, well, where can I get those? I just happen to know a place where you can get them. Mm-hmm. And it fell in Missoula that we got them from. So they ended up getting a few of them from there.
One of the things that my eye is drawn to as we look at this diorama are the white crosses. I wonder how many soldiers were just left on the battlefield or buried on site and never repatriated.
That's exactly true. And what I mentioned earlier about the, as you're advancing, if a soldier slipped into one of these shell holes, you wouldn't find him. Yeah. And there are circumstances even within the last 5 to 10 years where they've done excavations in battlefields and they found soldiers. Mm-hmm. There's one that it was on a television program, and they did an excavation. I think it was at the Battle of the Verdun. And they found a French soldier still in his greatcoat. Mm-hmm. And they said, well, how do you know he was a French soldier? Well, the color of the greatcoat. It was like a sky blue. That was atypical of the French soldiers. And then the French Adrian helmet as well, too. Mm-hmm. There were Allied units that used the same material. The American 91st and 92nd divisions were black divisions. They used French arms and material, and they went into battle with that. And the Allied troops look at that, that's the French troops over there. No, those are our guys. It was kind of humorous in a way. But that's one thing about the Canadians and the Germans. They both, their uniforms are really, again, primitive by today's standards. All wool. Some of them had even wool underwear. That we think about that today, that's got to be so uncomfortable. But one of the interesting characteristics about wool is that it wicks moisture away. So it doesn't retain moisture as much as like a cotton material. So even though the itchy wool and the ever-presence of a little critter they called cooties, which are lice, it was a good uniform for what that purpose was at the time. Over time, they actually improved it, and it changed for different types of material, different types of designs. But original Canadian World War I uniforms today are incredibly rare, hard to find, and if you do find them, especially identified to battalions, they are stratospherically expensive. I saw at the Canadian War Museum racks and racks and racks of original World War I uniforms, and I'm like, oh my God, that is amazing. But either way, plus now, and one of the other things, and I didn't really talk about it, was the arms of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. When they first went over to France and were deployed in 1915-ish, they were armed with a Canadian-made Ross rifle. That rifle was an incredibly accurate, well-made firearm. And we think of, everybody in Canada, virtually everybody knows about the Lee Enfield 303. Mm-hmm. That was a British design. Well, actually an American design, which was brought by the British. But the Ross rifle, made in Canada, was a straight pull. So you took the bolt handle, pulled it straight back, pushed it forward to charge the gun, and you could fire. Like I said, incredibly accurate and very well made. It was horrendous in the trenches. You get a little mud, a little bit of water in it, and it goes from a rifle to a club. It just didn't function. So they started using the British Lee Enfield, and that thing you could throw into the bottom of a trench in the mud and the muck and everything, pick it up, wipe it off, and start operating, and it would work. The Canadians really trained their men well, and they taught the men how to operate that and reload their arm very rapidly, but not just indiscriminate shooting. They taught them how to hit targets. And there's a thing called the Mad Minute. And that was a Canadian soldier said, there's your target right over there, 200 meters out. We want to put as many rounds on that target as you can in a minute. And some of these guys were able to fire 20 shots, etc. And that's reloading. And that was training that the men went to. I talked about training for the battle, but they're also trained on how to use their arms. And they did very, very, very well.
I think our next stop, Wes, would be to go into the trenches.
I love it. I think that's great. Looking forward to it.
Well, Wes, we are now in the trenches. This would be a depiction of what it was like in the area that we just saw. If you're in a battlefield and you are entrenched, this was your home. And
it was. And this is one of probably the key features of this regimental museum. And every detail you see in here, and I can point out a lot of things, and is how the trenches were built. Number one was the primary thing is the depth of the trench was, the way we've designed it and the way it was designed is a little bit lower than what they were back then. Some of the trenches were considerably deeper. However, early in the war, the trenches were nothing more than just a shallow depression that the guys were laying in. And they found that didn't work very well. So as they developed time, and as the Canadians got involved, you'll see the corrugated metal on the walls. That was something that the Canadians did. And that was all intended to hold up the walls of the trench. And I relate this to the 31st Battalion, which is what the South Alberta Light Horse perpetuates. When they went into the trenches, their first 100 days in the trenches, it rained 75 days. You just imagine that. I mentioned that earlier. Imagine what that does to the walls of the trench. It just starts sloughing. So what we did, this is how they would have been built, including the duckboards that you're standing on, which were basically intended to drain water away. And you'll see the firing step here. So the whole idea is to be under cover. So in order to fire at the bad guys, you'd get up on that firing step and you'd fire through the openings there. And you'll see some of the crates that are here, like period crates for the 303 ammunition, some rations, corned beef rations. These are all accurate renditions of crates from that period of time. We've got the White Star sweetened condensed milk, and a lot of the sandbags and stuff like that as well, too.
Now, you have a periscope here.
Yes.
You'd think of that as being on a submarine, but it served a very important purpose in the trench.
Incredibly important, because one of the things that soldiers were taught when they were sighting their arms across no man's land is the profile of the German helmet. That's what they would aim for. So if there is any way that you could avoid putting your head above the edge of the trench, that's what you used. And this was a very well-established, this is a design that was quite common, but it was sort of a pseudo-permanent design. A lot of them were kind of, cobbled together sort of thing, but there are some that very specific designs that were very compact, could be carried on the belt, some that would expand, like the collapsible type things. So they were really, really quite an innovation, and it saved soldiers' lives. You know, like the officers especially, they would take a look and say, okay, the bad guys are over there, but they're not over there, so I'm going to send my guys there where the bad guys are. And that was another thing. You'll see a little bit of the barbed wire. These cutouts here were basically intended to provide cover and a place where a soldier could get out of the wind or the rain or whatever conditions. In some of the trenches, they actually dug a large amount of stuff underground. They had field hospitals, they had offices, they had bedding, so it was quite, we think a trench is kind of a primitive thing, but back then, later in the war, they were quite advanced comparatively.
And this wasn't a temporary thing for a week or 2 weeks. Long time the soldiers would be in these.
My God, yeah. As I said, the 31st, they were in the trenches for 100 days. That was just a start. And there are some cases where the guys spent 6 months in trenches. Now, also, too, there's a lot of vermin in the trenches. They're not just the lice, but the rats and such like that. And that caused a lot of issues. And it also spread a lot of disease. In 1918, the Spanish flu epidemic hit. And Canadian soldiers and all Commonwealth soldiers and German soldiers, they were absolutely decimated. It was a horrible thing, and they lost thousands of men. So you imagine a Canadian soldier, I'm going to go to war, I'm going to kick the Kaiser and win the war, and he dies because of the flu. That was a very unfortunate thing.
And the sanitary conditions would have been appalling.
It was horrible. Now, there were actually dedicated sanitary corps within each division. That's what they took care of, was to, number one, was the health of the men. So they were involved with hospital corps, but they also took care of the bodily functions of the men that produced material that needed to be disposed of. They did that as well, too. So it wasn't a case of, you were standing in the trench here, it rains down there and they're going to do whatever they do. No, you had to be removed to another area of the trench system where they could take care of their normal functions. And then the food that they were supplied with was not exactly the best. We have our Burger King sandwich, we go to Timmy's and get our double and a donut and whatever. Yeah, they didn't have that. Yeah. They didn't have that.
Well, moving along now, there are some examples of some of the uniforms.
Yes. This uniform here is an example of an officer with the 3rd Canadian Mounted Rifles. He is Lieutenant Colonel. You'll notice how prim and proper that uniform is and how clean it is. That's typical of officers. I'm not going to say that really, but they were very utilitarian, but they're also very regimented. There were specifications of how these uniforms were supposed to appear. So the officers would contract tailors, usually in London, to manufacture these uniforms for you. So an officer would be given a list, here's 6 tailors that will make that uniform for you. So he goes in, he gets measured up, gets it tailor-made for him, and he would take care of it to the best of his ability. There's other equipment that they use, like they had valise bags for map cases and such like that. They had binocular cases and even some of their ration cases that they would carry as well, too. But the thing about the officers is that all of that material would be carried off-site, not necessarily to the trench or in the trench, but in the back areas like the holding areas. And they still had access to it, but they didn't bring it right to the front. So the officers, it was really kind of a stratified environment that the officers didn't, how can I say, socialize with the men. That was arm's length. They had their command structure, which was very, very regimented, and they had to keep it that way so that it would avoid the, how can I say, familiarity. That, oh, okay, now the basic private, yeah, I know Bert, he's our commanding officer, and he's a good friend of my family. Okay, that private got punted. You know, you can't have that. No. Because these guys were sending men into combat that could have technically and theoretically died in service. Yep.
What is this?
That is a trench alarm.
A trench alarm.
Now, as I mentioned earlier, that both Canadian and Germans, they employed a lot of poisonous gas, and mustard gas, phosgene, chlorine gas. And all of those had a very specific signature, as in a cloud. Chlorine in general would have been sort of an amber-colored cloud. Mustard would have actually been sort of more of a yellowish cloud. Phosgene was kind of a grayish-white. And if they happened to see that cloud, you'd grab that rope and ring that bell as hard as you could and as vigorously as you could. That's just,
Small example.
And that would indicate to everybody in the line to put on their gas mask. And we've got a sample of that in here. Now, the gas mask, when you think about it, it's not a supplied air system. It is a filtration system. And basically it was charged with the activated carbon, and it would nullify the effects of the gas. It didn't remove the gas, but it would nullify the effects. When the Canadians went into the trenches initially, they had what was called a gas hood, and basically a wool felt hood that they would wear over their heads, and they had a flapper valve that they would breathe through, and they had two little goggle eyes that they would use. Those things, they didn't work very well, and once they were exposed to water and rain, all the desiccant material compounds would vanish. And so they had to recharge them. And they actually urinated on those hoods. That would help act as a desiccant for those gases. And in the display case here we have a uniform of an officer with the 31st Battalion. He was a Military Cross winner. I believe he may have served in Vimy as well, too.
And then we have soldier in the trench.
Here's our average soldier. This guy's a corporal. And you'll see, if you look right here, that is the formation patch of the 31st Battalion. Now, that's another thing that the Canadian military did. They incorporated formation patches for all the divisions. Red division, the red was the first division. Blue, this was blue for the second. The third was like a sky blue. The fourth was a green. And what they would do, they'd add a geometric pattern to the top of that formation patch to indicate what battalion that the soldiers were identified to or assigned to. So this guy was assigned to the 31st Battalion. He's got his basic kit on, which was a pattern 1908 web kit. That include cartridge carriers, which are web cartridge flapped pockets. When the Canadians initially went into the trenches, they were issued with a leather cartridge box, which in the trenches and in all that rain and the environment, that leather just did not last. It was good, but it wasn't suitable for the environment. So they went into the web gear, which was quite an advance. And you can see he's armed with his, his Lee Enfield #1 Mark III with the long bayonet, and he's ready. He's just taking a break and ready to advance
whenever duty calls.
Exactly.
Wes, you've given us just a little hint of the flavor of what it was like to be in that battlefield.
I'm going to give you another hint, and we'll just walk to the side there and let the camera catch this. What you're going to see on here, these 3 panels are called the Roll of Honor. And this is for the 31st Battalion. When they were formed here in Canada and they were deployed to France, they had roughly about 1,100 men plus officers. You look at the number there, that's 930 that died in service. Now, that's listed alphabetically. Put that into perspective. 930 out of 1,100 men that died in service. Now, there were men that, like the 175th Battalion I had mentioned earlier, when they were deployed, they were formed here in Medicine Hat. They were deployed overseas, they got to France, or got to England, and they were broken up as a reserve battalion to fill battalions that had been depleted of men. So a lot of those guys, they served with the 50th Battalion, some of them ended up in the 31st Battalion. So they didn't serve as their identified 175th Battalion. So this really puts it into a perspective that when the people, and I have tours that come through and they stand there and they just stare at that, and then they realize, like, that's out of the 1,100 men. Then it just hits them, and that these guys here, what we do here in the Regimental Museum is honor the sacrifice of those men, but not only the men that were sacrificed during World War I, but also the men that were sacrificed during World War II and other actions after that. That's what we do here, and we thank them and we honor them.
And the people, if they want to come through here, when can they come and visit?
Well, we are open every Wednesday afternoon from 1 to 4 p.m. If you're unable to come out during that time, contact me by email at salhrmcurator@gmail.com, and I will make arrangements. We've had arrangements to bring groups of tours in. I'm working with a Rotary Club to bring them in and such like that. I do cadet tours and other historical tours as well, too. So we just love to bring people in here and let them know what's going on here.
Well, we say it in November, lest we forget, but we need to remember that every day.
And we do.
Thank you, Wes.
And thank you for coming out here. I hope you had enjoyed it.
Oh, I did.